Dear listeners, welcome to the channel, The Story Vault. Today, we have an exciting collection of 3 detective stories by the brilliant Agatha Christie. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the thrilling mysteries. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our upcoming videos. Happy listening! Agatha Christie, blind man's buff, right, said Tommy and replaced the receiver on its hook. Then he turned to Tuppence. That was the chief. Seems to have got the wind up about us. It appears that the parties we're after have got wise to the fact that I'm not the genuine Mr. Theodore Blunt. We're to expect excitements at any minute. The chief begs you, as a favor, to go home and stay at home and not mix yourself up in it anymore. Apparently, the hornet's nest we've stirred up is bigger than anyone imagined. All that about my going home is nonsense, said Tuppence decidedly. Who is going to look after you if I go home? Besides, I like excitement. Business hasn't been very brisk just lately. Well, one can't have murders and robberies every day, said Tommy. Be reasonable. Now, my idea is this: when business is slack, we ought to do a certain amount of home exercises every day, lie on our backs and wave our feet in the air, that sort of thing. Don't be so literal in your interpretation. When I say exercises, I mean exercises in the detective art. Reproductions of the great masters, for instance. From the drawer beside him, Tommy took out a formidable dark green eyeshade covering both eyes. This he adjusted with some care. Then he drew a watch from his pocket. I broke the glass this morning, he remarked. That paved the way for its being the crystalline watch which my sensitive fingers touch so lightly. Be careful, said Tuppence. You nearly had the short hand off then. Give me your hand, said Tommy. He held it, one finger feeling for the pulse. Ah, the keyboard of silence. This woman has not got heart disease, I suppose, said Tuppence. That you are Thornley Colton? Just so, said Tommy, the blind problemist. And your thingy-bob, the black-haired Applechase secretary? The bundle of baby clothes picked up on the banks of the English River, finished Tuppence. And Albert is the fee. Alias Shrimp, we must teach him to say G, said Tuppence. And his voice isn't shrill, it's dreadfully hoarse. Against the wall by the door, said Tommy, you perceive the slim hollow cane which, held in my sensitive hand, tells me so much. He rose and cannonied into a chair. Damn, said Tommy, I forgot that chair was there. It must be beastly to be blind, said Tuppence with feeling. Rather, agreed Tommy heartily. I'm sorry for all those poor devils who lost their eyesight in the war than for anyone else. But they say that when you live in the dark, you really do develop special senses. That's what I want to try and see if one couldn't do. It would be jolly handy to train oneself to be some good in the dark. Now then, be a good Sidney Temps. How many steps to that cane? Tuppence made a desperate guess. 3 straight, 5 left, she hazarded. Tommy paced it uncertainly, tense, interrupting with a cry of warning as she realized that the 4th step left would take him slap against the wall. There's a lot in this, said Tuppence. You've no idea how difficult it is to judge how many steps are needed. It's jolly interesting, said Tommy. Call Albert in. I'm going to shake hands with you both and see if I know which is which. All right, said Tuppence, but Albert must wash his hands first. They're sure to be sticky from those beastly acid drops he's always eating. Albert, introduced to the game, was full of interest. Tommy, the handshakes completed, smiled complacently. The keyboard of silence cannot lie, he murmured. The first was Albert, the second you, Tuppen. Wrong! Shrieked Tuppen. Keyboard of silence, indeed. You went by my wedding ring, and I put that on Albert's finger. Various other experiments were carried out with indifferent success. But it's coming, declared Tommy. One can't expect to be infallible straight away. I tell you what, it's just lunchtime. You and I will go to the Blitz, tuppence. Blind man and his keeper, some jolly useful tips to be picked up there. I say, Tommy, we shall get into trouble. No, we shan't. I shall behave quite like the little gentleman. But I bet you that by the end of luncheon, I shall be startling you all. Protests being thus overborne, a quarter of an hour later saw Tommy and Tuppence comfortably ensconced at a corner table in the gold room of the Blitz. Tommy ran his fingers lightly over the menu. Pâté de foie gras and grilled chicken for me, he murmured. Tuppence also made her selection, and the waiter moved away. So far, so good, said Tommy. Now for a more ambitious venture. What beautiful legs that girl in the short skirt has, the one who has just come in. How is that done, Tommy? Beautiful legs impart a particular vibration to the floor, which is received by my hollow cane. Or, to be honest, in a big restaurant, there is nearly always a girl with beautiful legs standing in the doorway looking for her friends. And with short skirts going about, she'd be sure to take advantage of them. The meal proceeded. The man 2 tables from us is a very wealthy profiteer. I fancy, said Tommy carelessly. Pretty good, said Tuppence appreciatively. I don't follow that one. I shan't tell you how it's done every time, it spoils my show. The head waiter is serving champagne 3 tables off to the right. A stout woman in black is about to pass our table. Tommy, how can you? You're beginning to see what I can do. That's a nice girl in brown just getting up at the table behind you. No, said Tuppence. It's a young man in gray. Oh, said Tommy, momentarily disconcerted. And at that moment, 2 men who had been sitting at a table not far away and who had been watching the young pair with keen interest got up and came across to the corner table. Excuse me, said the elder of the 2, a tall, well-dressed man with an eyeglass and a small gray mustache, but you have been pointed out to me as Mr. Theodore Blunt. May I ask if that is so? Tommy hesitated a minute, feeling somewhat at a disadvantage, then he bowed his head. That is so. I am Mr. Blunt. What an unexpected piece of good fortune, Mr. Blunt. I was going to call at your offices after lunch. I am in trouble, very grave trouble. But excuse me, you have had some accident to your eyes? My dear sir, said Tommy in a melancholy voice, I am blind. Completely blind. What? You are? Astonished? But surely you have heard of blind detectives in fiction? Never in real life, and I have certainly never heard that you were blind. Many people are not aware of the fact, murmured Tommy. I am wearing an eye shade today to save my eyeballs from glare, but without it, quite a host of people have never suspected my infirmity, if you call it that. You see, my eyes cannot mislead me. But enough of all this. Shall we go at once to my office, or will you give me the facts of the case here? The latter would be best, I think. A waiter brought up 2 extra chairs, and the 2 men sat down. The second man, who had not yet spoken, was shorter, sturdy in build, and very dark. It is a matter of great delicacy, said the older man, dropping his voice confidentially. He looked uncertainly at Tuppence. Mr. Blunt seemed to feel the glance. Let me introduce my confidential secretary, he said. Miss Ganges, found on the banks of the Indian River, a mere bundle of baby clothes. Very sad history. Miss Ganges is my eyes. She accompanies me everywhere. The stranger acknowledged the introduction with a bow. Then I can speak out, Mr. Blunt. My daughter, a girl of 16, has been abducted under somewhat peculiar circumstances I discovered this half an hour ago. The circumstances of the case were such that I dared not call in the police. Instead, I rang up your office. They told me you were out to lunch but would be back by 2:30. I came in here with my friend Captain Harker. The short man jerked his head and muttered something. By the greatest good fortune, you happen to be lunching here also. We must lose no time. You must return with me to my house immediately. Tommy demurred cautiously. I can be with you in half an hour. I must return to my office first. Captain Harker, turning to glance at Tuppence, may have been surprised to see a half-smile lurking for a moment at the corner of her mouth. No, that will not do. You must return with me. The gray-haired man took a card from his pocket and handed it across the table. That is my name. Tommy fingered it. My fingers are hardly sensitive enough for that, he said with a smile and handed it to Tuppence, who read out in a low voice, the Duke of Blair. She looked with great interest at their client. The Duke of Blair was well known to be a most haughty and inaccessible nobleman who had married as a wife the daughter of a Chicago pork butcher, many years younger than himself and of a lively temperament that boded ill for their future together. There had been rumors of discord lately. You will come at once, Mr. Blunt, said the Duke with a tinge of authority in his manner. Tommy yielded to the inevitable. Miss Ganges and I will come with you, he said quietly. You will excuse my just stopping to drink a large cup of black coffee. They will serve it immediately. I am subject to very distressing headaches, the result of my eye trouble, and the coffee steadies my nerves. He called a waiter and gave the order. Then he spoke to Tuppence. Miss Ganges, I am lunching here tomorrow with the French prefect of police. Just note down the luncheon and give it to the head waiter with instructions to reserve me my usual table. I am assisting the French police in an important case. The fee paused is considerable. Are you ready, Miss Ganges? Quite ready, said Tuppence, her stylo poised. We will start with that special salad of shrimps that they have here. Then to follow, yes, omelette blitz and perhaps a couple of tundo. Al, he looked up, catching the Duke's eye. You will forgive me, I hope, he murmured. Ah yes, soul or supper, that will include the repast. A most interesting man, the French prefect. You know him? Perhaps? The other replied in the negative as Tense rose and went to speak to the head waiter. Presently, she returned just as the coffee was brought. Tommy drank a large cup of it, sipping it slowly. Then rose. My can, Miss Ganges. Thank you. Directions, please. It was a moment of agony for Tuppence. 1 right, 18 straight, about the 5th step. Step, there is a waiter serving the table on your left. Swinging his cane jauntily, Tommy set out. Tuppence kept close beside him and endeavored unobtrusively to steer him. All went well until they were just passing out through the doorway. A man entered rather hurriedly, and before Tuppence could warn the blind Mr. Blunt, he had barged right into the newcomer. Explanations and apologies ensued. At the door of the Blitz, a smart lollet was waiting.
The Duke himself aided Mr. Blunt to get in. "Your car here, Harker?" he asked over his shoulder. "Yes, just round the corner." "Take Miss Ganges in it, will you?" Before another word could be said, he had jumped in beside Tommy, and the car rolled smoothly away. "A very delicate matter," murmured the Duke. "I can soon acquaint you with all the details." Tommy raised his hand to his head. "I can remove my eye shade now," he observed pleasantly. It was only the glare of artificial light in the restaurant necessitated its use, but his arm was jerked down sharply. At the same time, he felt something hard and round being poked between his ribs. "No, my dear Mr. Blunt," said the Duke's voice, but a voice that seemed suddenly different. "You will not remove that eye shade. You will sit perfectly still and not move in any way. You understand? I don't want this pistol of mine to go off. You see, I happen not to be the Duke of Blair at all. I borrowed his name for the occasion, knowing that you would not refuse to accompany such a celebrated client. I am something much more prosaic, a ham merchant who has lost his wife." He felt the start the other gave. "That tells you something." He laughed. "My dear young man, you have been incredibly foolish. I'm very much afraid, that your activities will be curtailed in the future." He spoke the last words with a sinister relish. Tommy sat motionless. He did not reply to the other's taunts. Presently, the car slackened its pace and drew up. "Just a minute," said the pseudo-duke. He twisted a handkerchief deftly into Tommy's mouth and drew up his scarf over it. "In case you should be foolish enough to think of calling for help," he explained suavely. The door of the car opened, and the chauffeur stood ready. He and his master took Tommy between them and propelled him rapidly up some steps and in at the door of a house. The door closed behind them. There was a rich oriental smell in the air. Tommy's feet sank deep into velvet pile. He was propelled in the same fashion up a flight of stairs and into a room, which he judged to be at the back of the house. Here, the two men bound his hands together. The chauffeur went out again, and the other removed the gag. "You may speak freely now," he announced pleasantly. "What have you to say for yourself, young man?" Tommy cleared his throat and eased the aching corners of his mouth. "I hope you haven't lost my hollow cane," he said mildly. "It cost me a lot to have that made." "You have nerve," said the other after a minute's pause, "or else you're just a fool. Don't you understand that I have got you in the hollow of my hand, that you're absolutely in my power? No one who knows you is ever likely to see you again." "Can't we cut out the melodrama?" asked Tommy plaintively. "Have I got to say, 'You villain, I'll foil you' yet? That sort of thing is so very much out of date." "What about the girl?" said the other, watching him. "Doesn't that move you? Putting two and two together during my enforced silence just now," said Tommy, "I have come to the inevitable conclusion that the chatty lad Harker is another of the doers of desperate deeds, and that, therefore, my unfortunate secretary will shortly join this little tea party. Right as to one point, but wrong on the other. Mrs. Beresford, you see, I know all about you. Mrs. Beresford will not be brought here. That is a little precaution I took. It occurred to me that just probably your friends in high places might be keeping you shadowed. In that case, by dividing the pursuit, you could not both be trailed. I should still keep one in my hands. I am waiting now." He broke off as the door opened. The chauffeur spoke, "We've not been followed." Sir. It's all clear. Good. You can go, Gregory. The door closed again. So far, so good, said the Duke. And now, what are we to do with you, Mr. Beresford?
Bluntly, I wish you'd take this confounded eyeshade off me, said Tommy.
I think not. With it on, you are truly blind. Without it, you would see as well as I do, and that would not suit my little plan. For I have a plan. You are fond of sensational fiction, Mr. Blunt. This little game that you and your wife were playing today proves that. Now I, too, have arranged a little game, something rather ingenious, as I am sure you will admit when I explain it to you. You see, this floor on which you are standing is made of metal, and here and there on its surface are little projections. I touch a switch, so a sharp click sounded. Now the electric current is switched on. To tread on one of those little knobs now means death, you understand. If you could see, but you cannot see, you are in the dark. That is the game, blind man's buff with death. If you can reach the door in safety, freedom. But I think that long before you reach it, you will have trodden on one of the danger spots, and that will be very amusing for me. He came forward and unbound Tommy's hands. Then he handed him his cane with a little ironical bow. The blind problemist. Let us see if he will solve this problem. I shall stand here with my pistol ready. If you raise your hands to your head to remove that eyeshade, I shoot. Is that clear? Perfectly clear, said Tommy. He was rather pale but determined. I haven't got a dog's chance, I suppose? Oh, that, the other shrugged his shoulders. Damned ingenious devil, aren't you? Said Tommy. But you've forgotten one thing. May I light a cigarette, by the way? My poor little heart's going pit-a-pat. You may light a cigarette, but no tricks. I am watching you, remember, with the pistol ready. I'm not a performing dog, said Tommy. I don't do tricks. He extracted a cigarette from his case, then felt for a matchbox. It's all right, I'm not feeling for a revolver. But you know well enough that I'm not armed. All the same, as I said before, you've forgotten one thing. What is that? Tommy took a match from the box and held it ready to strike. I'm blind and you can see, that's admitted. The advantage is with you. But supposing we were both in the dark, eh? Where's your advantage then? He struck the match. The Duke laughed contemptuously. Thinking of shooting at the switch of the lights, plunging the room into darkness, it can't be done, just so, said Tommy. I can't give you darkness, but extremes meet, you know. What about light? As he spoke, he touched the match to something he held in his hand and threw it down upon the table. A blinding glare filled the room just for a minute. Blinded by the intense white light, the Duke blinked and fell back, his pistol hand lowered. He opened his eyes again to feel something sharp pricking his breast. Drop that pistol, ordered Tommy. Drop it quick. I agree with you that a hollow cane is a pretty rotten affair, so I didn't get one. A good sword stick is a very useful weapon though, don't you think so? Almost as useful as magnesium wire. Drop that pistol. Obedient to the necessity of that sharp point, the man dropped it. Then, with a laugh, he sprang back. But I still have the advantage, he mocked, for I can see, and you cannot. That's where you're wrong, said Tommy. I can see perfectly. This eyeshade's a fake.
I was going to put one over on tuppence, make 1 or 2 bloomers to begin with, and then put in some perfectly marvelous stuff towards the end of the lunch. Why, bless you, I could have walked to the door and avoided all the knobs with perfect ease.
But I didn't trust you to play a sporting game.
You'd never have let me get out of this alive.
Careful now,
for, with his face distorted with rage, the Duke sprang forward, forgetting in his fury to look where he put his feet. There was a sudden blue crackle of flame, and he swayed for a minute, then fell like a log.
A faint odor of singed flesh filled the room, mingling with a stronger smell of ozone.
"Phew," said Tommy. He wiped his face. Then, moving gingerly and with every precaution, he reached the wall and touched the switch he had seen the other manipulate. He crossed the room to the door, opened it carefully, and looked out.
There was no one about.
He went down the stairs and out through the front door. Safe in the street, he looked up at the house with a shudder, noting the number. Then he hurried to the nearest telephone box. There was a moment of agonizing anxiety, and then a well-known voice spoke.
"Tommy? Thank goodness. Yes, I'm all right. I got all your points. The fee shrimp? Come to the Blitz and follow the 2 strangers."
Albert got there in time, and when we went off in separate cars, he followed me in a taxi, saw where they took me, and rang up the police. "Albert's a good lad," said Tommy chivalrously. "I was pretty sure he'd choose to follow you, but I've been worried all the same."
"I've got lots to tell you.
I'm coming straight back now, and the first thing I shall do when I get back is to write a thumping big check for say
Dunstan's. Lord, it must be awful not to be able to see Agatha Christie, The House of Lurking Death, what began, tuppence, and then stopped."
She had just entered the private office of Mr. Blunt from the adjoining one marked clerks and was surprised to behold her lord and master with his eye riveted to the private peephole into the outer office.
"Shoo," said Tommy warningly. "Didn't you hear the buzzer? It's a girl, rather a nice girl.
In fact, she looks to me a frightfully nice girl. Albert is telling her all that tsh about my being engaged with Scotland Yard." "Let me see," demanded Tuppence somewhat unwillingly.
Tommy moved aside. Tuppence, in her turn, glued her eye to the peephole.
"She's not bad," admitted Tuppence, "and her clothes are simply the latest shout." "She's perfectly lovely," said Tommy. "She's like those girls Mason writes about, you know, frightfully sympathetic and beautiful and distinctly intelligent without being too saucy." "I think yes, I certainly think I shall be the great Hannah this morning," said Tuppence. "If there is one detective out of all the others whom you are most unlike, I should say it was Hannah."
"Can you do the lightning changes of personality? Can you be the great comedian, the little gutter boy?
The serious and sympathetic friend, all in 5 minutes." "I know this," said Tommy, rapping sharply on the desk. "I am the captain of the ship, and don't you forget it, Tuppence."
"I'm going to have her in."
He pressed the buzzer on his desk. Albert appeared, ushering in the client. The girl stopped in the doorway as though undecided.
Tommy came forward. "Come in, mademoiselle," he said kindly, "and seat yourself here."
Tuppence choked audibly, and Tommy turned upon her with a swift change of manner. His tone was menacing.
"You spoke, Miss Robinson?" "Ah no, I thought not." He turned back to the girl. "We will not be serious or formal," he said. "You will just tell me all about it, and then we will discuss the best way to help you." "You are very kind," said the girl. "Excuse me, but are you a foreigner?"
A fresh choke from Tuppence. Tommy glared in her direction out of the corner of his eye. "Not exactly," he said with difficulty, "but of late years I have worked a good deal abroad. My methods are the methods of the charite."
"Oh." The girl seemed impressed.
She was, as Tommy had indicated, a very charming girl, young and slim, with a trace of golden hair peeping out from under her little brown felt hat and big serious eyes. That she was nervous could be plainly seen. Her little hands were twisting themselves together, and she kept clasping and unclasping the catch of her lacquer red handbag.
"First of all, Mr. Blunt,
I must tell you that my name is Lois Hargreaves. I live in a great rambling old-fashioned house called Thurley Grange.
It is in the heart of the country.
There is the village of Thurley nearby, but it is very small and insignificant. There is plenty of hunting in winter, and we get tennis in summer, and I have never felt lonely there.
Indeed, I much prefer country to town life.
I tell you this so that you may realize that in a country village like ours, everything that happens is of supreme importance. About a week ago I got a box of chocolates sent through the post. There was nothing inside to indicate who they came from. Now, I myself am not particularly fond of chocolates, but the others in the house are, and the box was passed around. As a result, everyone who had eaten any chocolates was taken ill. We sent for the doctor, and after various inquiries as to what other things had been eaten, he took the remains of the chocolates away with him and had them analyzed. Mr. Blunt, those chocolates contained arsenic, not enough to kill anyone, but enough to make anyone quite ill."
"Extraordinary," commented Tommy.
Dr. Burton was very excited over the matter. It seems that this was the third occurrence of the kind in the neighborhood. In each case, a big house was selected, and the inmates were taken ill after eating the mysterious chocolates. It looked as though some local person of weak intellect was playing a particularly fishy practical joke. "Quite so, Miss Hargreaves." Dr. Burton put it down to socialist agitation rather absurdly, I thought, but there are one or two malcontents in Thurley village, and it seemed possible that they might have had something to do with it. Dr. Burton was very keen that I should put the whole thing in the hands of the police. "A very natural suggestion," said Tommy.
"But you have not done so, I gather, Miss Hargreaves?"
"No," admitted the girl. "I hate the fuss and the publicity that would ensue.
And you see, I know our local inspector. I can never imagine him finding out anything.
I have often seen your advertisements, and I told Dr. Burton that it would be much better to call in a private detective."
"I see.
You say a great deal about discretion in your advertisement. I take that to mean that you would not make anything public without my consent."
Tommy looked at her curiously, but it was Tuppence who spoke.
"I think," she said quietly, "that it would be as well if Miss Hargreaves told us everything." She laid a special stress upon the last word, and Lois Hargreaves flushed nervously.
"Yes," said Tommy quickly, "Miss Robinson is right.
You must tell us everything. You will not," she hesitated, "everything you say is understood to be strictly in confidence."
"Thank you. I know that I ought to have been quite frank with you.
I have a reason for not going to the police, Mr. Blunt.
That box of chocolates was sent by someone in our house."
"How do you know that, mademoiselle?"
"It's very simple.
I've got a habit of drawing a little silly thing, 3 fish intertwined, whenever I have a pencil in my hand. A parcel of silk stockings arrived from a certain shop in London not long ago. We were at the breakfast table. I'd just been marking something in the newspaper, and without thinking, I began to draw my silly little fish on the label of the parcel before cutting the string and opening it. I thought no more about the matter, but when I was examining the piece of brown paper in which the chocolates had been sent, I caught sight of the corner of the original label, most of which had been torn off. My silly little drawing was on it. Tommy drew his chair forward. That is very serious. It creates, as you say, a very strong presumption that the sender of the chocolates is a member of your household. But you will forgive me if I say that I still do not see why that fact should render you indisposed to call in the police. Lois Hargreaves looked him squarely in the face. I will tell you, Mr. Blunt. I may want the whole thing hushed up. Tommy retired gracefully from the position. In that case, he murmured, we know where we are. I see, Miss Hargreaves, that you are not disposed to tell me who it is you suspect. I suspect no one. But there are possibilities. Quite so. Now will you describe the household to me in detail? The servants, with the exception of the parlor maid, are all old ones who have been with us many years. I must explain to you, Mr. Blunt, that I was brought up by my aunt, Lady Radcliffe, who was extremely wealthy. Her husband made a big fortune and was knighted. It was he who bought Thurley Grange, but he died 2 years after going there. It was then that Lady Radcliffe sent for me to come and make my home with her. I was her only living relation. The other inmate of the house was Dennis Radcliffe, her husband's nephew. I have always called him cousin, but, of course, he is really nothing of the kind. Aunt Lucy always said openly that she intended to leave her money, with the exception of a small provision for me, to Dennis. It was Radcliffe money, she said, and ought to go to a Radcliffe. However, when Dennis was 22, she quarreled violently with him over some debts that he had run up. I think when she died a year later, I was astonished to find that she had made a will leaving all her money to me. It was, I know, a great blow to Dennis, and I felt very badly about it. I would have given him the money if he would have taken it, but it seems that that kind of thing can't be done. However, as soon as I was 21, I made a will leaving it all to him. That's the least I can do. So if I'm run over by a motor, Dennis will come into his own. Exactly, said Tommy. And when were you 21, if I may ask the question? Just 3 weeks ago. Ah, said Tommy. Now will you give me fuller particulars of the members of your household at this minute? Servants or others? Both. The servants, as I say, have been with us some time. There is old Mrs. Holly, the cook, and her niece Rose, the kitchen maid. Then there are 2 elderly housemaids, and Hannah, who was my aunt's maid and who has always been devoted to me. The parlor maid is called Esther Quant and seems a very nice, quiet girl. As for ourselves, there is Miss Logan, who was Aunt Lucy's companion, and who runs the house for me and Captain Radcliffe Dennis, you know, whom I told you about. And there is a girl called Mary Chilcott, an old school friend of mine, who is staying with us. Tommy thought for a moment. That all seems fairly clear and straightforward, Miss Hars, he said after a minute or two. I take it that you have no special reason for attaching suspicion more to one person than another. You are only afraid it might prove to be, well, not a servant, shall we say? That's it exactly, Mr. Blunt. I have honestly no idea who used that piece of brown paper. The handwriting was printed. There seems only one thing to be done, said Tommy. I must be on the spot. The girl looked at him inquiringly. Tommy went on after a moment's thought. I suggest that you prepare the way for the arrival of, say, Mr. and Miss Van Dunn, American friends of yours.
Will you be able to do that quite naturally?
Oh yes, there will be no difficulty at all.
When will you come down?
Tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, if you please. There is no time to waste.
That is settled then.
The girl rose and held out her hand.
One thing, Miss Hars, not a word, mind, to anyone at all, that we are not what we seem.
What do you think of it, Tuppen? He asked when he returned from showing the visitor out.
I don't like it, said Tuppen decidedly.
Especially, I don't like the chocolates having so little arsenic in them.
What do you mean? Don't you see?
All those chocolates being sent around the neighborhood were a blind to establish the idea of a local maniac. Then, when the girl was really poisoned, it would be thought to be the same thing. You see, but for a stroke of luck, no one would ever have guessed that the chocolates were actually sent by someone in the house itself.
That was a stroke of luck.
You're right.
You think it's a deliberate plot against the girl?
Herself, I'm afraid so. I remember reading about old Lady Radcliffe's will.
That girl has come into a terrific lot of money.
Yes, and she came of age and made a will 3 weeks ago.
It looks bad for Dennis Radcliffe.
He gains by her death.
Tuppence nodded. The worst of it is that she thinks so too.
That's why she won't have the police called in. Already she suspects him, and she must be more than half in love with him to act as she has done.
In that case, said Tommy thoughtfully, why the devil doesn't he marry her?
Much simpler and safer. Tuppence stared at him. You've said a mouthful, she observed.
Oh boy, I'm getting ready to be Miss Van Duyn.
You observe why rush to crime where there is a lawful means near at hand?
Tuppence reflected for a minute or two.
I've got it, she announced clearly. He must have married a barmaid whilst at Oxford. Origin of the quarrel with his aunt. That explains everything. Then why not send poisoned sweets to the barmaid, suggested Tommy. Much more practical. I wish you wouldn't jump to these wild conclusions, Tuppence. They're deductions, said Tuppence with a good deal of dignity. This is your first case, my friend, but when you have been 20 minutes in the arena, Tommy flung the office cushion at her. Tuppence, I say, come here. It was breakfast time the next morning.
Tuppence hurried out of her bedroom and into the dining room.
Tommy was striding up and down, the open newspaper in his hand. What's the matter? Tommy wheeled round and shoved the paper into her hand, pointing to the headlines. Mysterious poisoning case, deaths from fig sandwiches. Tuppence read on. This mysterious outbreak of ptomaine poisoning had occurred at Thurley Grange. The deaths so far reported were those of Miss Lois Hargreaves, the owner of the house, and the parlour-maid, Esther Quant. A Captain Radcliffe and a Miss Logan were reported to be still seriously ill. The cause of the outbreak was supposed to be some fig paste used in sandwiches, since another lady, a Miss Chilcot, who had not partaken of these, was reported to be quite well. We must get down there at once, said Tommy. That girl, that perfectly ripping girl. Why the devil didn't I go straight down there with her yesterday? If you had, said Tuppence, you'd probably have eaten fig sandwiches too for tea, and then you'd have been dead. Come on, let's start, at once. I see it says that Dennis Radcliffe is seriously ill also. Probably shamming, the dirty blackguard. They arrived at the small village of Thurley about midday. An elderly woman with red eyes opened the door to them when they arrived at Thurley Grange.
"Look here," said Tommy quickly before she could speak, "I'm not a reporter or anything like that. Miss Hargreaves came to see me yesterday and asked me to come down here. Is there anyone I can see?"
"Dr. Burton is here now if you'd like to speak to him," said the woman doubtfully, "or Miss Chilcot, she's making all the arrangements." But Tommy had caught at the first suggestion. "Dr. Burton," he said authoritatively. "I should like to see him at once if he is here." The woman showed them into a small morning room. 5 minutes later the door opened, and a tall elderly man with bent shoulders and a kind but worried face came in. "Dr. Burton," said Tommy. He produced his professional card. "Miss Hargreaves called on me yesterday with reference to those poisoned chocolates. I came down to investigate the matter at her request." Alas, too late. The doctor looked at him keenly. "You are Mr. Blunt himself?" "Yes. This is my assistant, Miss Robinson." The doctor bowed to Tuppence. "Under the circumstances, there is no need for reticence. But for the episode of the chocolates, I might have believed these deaths to be the result of severe ptomaine poisoning, but ptomaine poisoning of an unusually virulent kind. There is gastrointestinal inflammation and hemorrhage. As it is, I am taking the fig paste to be analyzed." "You suspect arsenic poisoning?" "No, the poison, if a poison has been employed, is something far more potent and swift in its action. It looks more like some powerful vegetable toxin." "I see. I should like to ask you, Dr. Burton, whether you are thoroughly convinced that Captain Radcliffe is suffering from the same form of poisoning." The doctor looked at him. "Captain Radcliffe is not suffering from any sort of poisoning now." "Ahu," said Tommy. "Captain Radcliffe died at 5 o'clock this morning." Tommy was utterly taken aback. The doctor prepared to depart. "And the other victim, Miss Logan?" asked Tuppence. "I have every reason to hope that she will recover since she has survived so far. Being an older woman, the poison seems to have had less effect on her. I will let you know the result of the analysis, Mr. Blunt. In the meantime, Miss Chilcot will, I am sure, tell you anything you want to know." As he spoke, the door opened, and a girl appeared. She was tall, with a tanned face and steady blue eyes. Dr. Burton performed the necessary introductions. "I am glad you have come, Mr. Blunt," said Mary Chilcot. "This affair seems too terrible. Is there anything you want to know that I can tell you? Where did the fig paste come from?" "It is a special kind that comes from London. We often have it." No one suspected that this particular pot differed from any of the others. "Personally, I dislike the flavor of figs. That explains my immunity. I cannot understand how Dennis was affected since he was out for tea. He must have picked up a sandwich when he came home, I suppose." Tommy felt Tuppence's hand press his arm ever so slightly. "What time did he come in?" he asked. "I don't really know. I could find out." "Thank you, Miss Chilcot." "It doesn't matter. You have no objection, I hope, to my questioning the servants?" "Please do anything you like, Mr. Blunt. I am nearly distraught." "Tell me you don't think there has been foul play." Her eyes were very anxious as she put the question. "I don't know what to think. We shall soon know. Yes, I suppose Dr. Burton will have the paste analyzed quickly." Excusing herself, she went out by the window to speak to one of the gardeners. You take the housemaid, twopence, said Tommy, and I'll find my way to the kitchen. I say, Miss Chilcot may feel very distraught, but she doesn't look it.
Twopence nodded assent without replying. Husband and wife met half an hour later. Now to pool results, said Tommy. The sandwiches came out for tea, and the parlor maid ate one. That's how she got it in the neck. Cook is positive Dennis Radcliffe hadn't returned when tea was cleared away. Query, how did he get poisoned? He came in at 6:45, said Twopence. The housemaid saw him from one of the windows. He had a cocktail before dinner in the library. She was just clearing away the glass now, and luckily I got it from her before she washed it. It was after that he complained of feeling ill. Good, said Tommy. I'll take that glass along to Burton presently. Anything else? I'd like you to see Hannah, the maid. She's queer. How do you mean queer? She looks to me as though she were going off her head. Let me see her. Twopence led the way upstairs. Hannah had a small sitting room of her own. The maid sat upright on a high chair. On her knees was an open Bible. She did not look towards the two strangers as they entered. Instead, she continued to read aloud to herself, "Let hot burning coals fall upon them, let them be cast into the fire and into the pit, that they never rise up again." May I speak to you a minute? Asked Tommy. Hannah made an impatient gesture with her hand. This is no time. The time is running short, I say. I will follow upon mine enemies and overtake them, neither will I turn again till I have destroyed them. So it is written. The word of the Lord has come to me. I am the scourge of the Lord. Mad as a hatter, murmured Tommy. She's been going on like that all the time, whispered Twopence. Tommy picked up a book that was lying open face downwards on the table. He glanced at the title and slipped it into his pocket. Suddenly, the old woman rose and turned towards them menacingly. Go out from here. The time is at hand. I am the flail of the Lord. The wind bloweth where it listeth, so do I destroy. The ungodly shall perish. This is a house of evil, of evil. I tell you, beware of the wrath of the Lord, whose handmaiden I am. She advanced upon them fiercely. Tommy thought it best to humor her and withdrew. As he closed the door, he saw her pick up the Bible again. I wonder if she's always been like that, he muttered. He drew from his pocket the book he had picked up off the table. Look at that funny reading for an ignorant maid. Twopence took the book. Materia Medica, she murmured. She looked at the flyleaf. Edward Logan. It's an old book, Tommy. I wonder if we could see Miss Logan. Dr. Burton said she was better. Shall we ask Miss Chilcot? No. Let's get hold of a housemaid and send her in to ask, after a brief delay. They were informed that Miss Logan would see them. They were taken into a big bedroom facing over the lawn. In the bed was an old lady with white hair, her delicate old face drawn by suffering. I have been very ill, she said faintly, and I can't talk much. But Ellen tells me you are detectives. Lois went to consult you, then? She spoke of doing so, yes, Miss Logan, said Tommy. We don't want to tire you, but perhaps you can answer a few questions. The maid, Hannah, is she quite right in her head? Miss Logan looked at them with obvious surprise. Oh yes, she is very religious, but there is nothing wrong with her." Tommy held out the book he had taken from the table. "Is this yours, Miss Logan?" "Yes, it was one of my father's books.
He was a great doctor, one of the pioneers of serum therapeutics." The old lady's voice rang with pride. "Quite so," said Tommy. "I thought I knew his name," he added mendaciously.
"This book now, did you lend it to Hannah?" "To Hannah?" Miss Logan raised herself in bed with indignation. "No, indeed.
She wouldn't understand the first word of it.
It is a highly technical book." "Yes, I see that. Yet I found it in Hannah's room." "Disgraceful," said Miss Logan. "I will not have the servants touching my things." "Where ought it to be?"
"In the bookshelf in my sitting room. Or stay, I lent it to Mary. The dear girl is very interested in herbs. She has made 1 or 2 experiments in my little kitchen. I have a little place of my own, where I brew laws and make preserves in the old-fashioned way. Dear Lucy, Lady Radcliffe, used to swear by my tanny tea, a wonderful thing for a cold in the head. Poor Lucy, she was subject to colds.
So is Dennis, dear boy.
His father was my first cousin."
Tommy interrupted these reminiscences.
"This kitchen of yours, does anyone else use it except you and Miss Chilcot?" "Hannah clears up there, and she boils the kettle there for our early morning tea." "Thank you, Miss Logan," said Tommy.
"There is nothing more I want to ask you at present."
"I hope we haven't tired you too much." He left the room and went down the stairs, frowning to himself. "There is something here, my dear Mr. Ricardo, that I do not understand." "I hate this house," said Tuppence with a shiver. "Let us go for a good long walk and try to think things out."
Tommy complied, and they set out.
First, they left the cocktail glass at the doctor's house and then set off for a good walk across the country, discussing the case as they did so. It makes it easier somehow. "If one plays the fool," said Tommy, "all this herd business. I suppose some people would think I didn't care, but I do, most awfully. I feel that somehow or other, we ought to have prevented this." "I think that's foolish of you," said Kent. "It is not as though we had advised Lois Hargreaves not to go to Scotland Yard or anything like that. Nothing would have induced her to bring the police into the matter. If she hadn't come to us, she would have done nothing at all, and the result would have been the same. Yes, you are right, Tuppen. It's morbid to reproach oneself over something one couldn't help.
What I would like to do is to make good now. And that's not going to be easy."
"No, it isn't. There are so many possibilities, and yet all of them seem wild and improbable."
"Supposing Dennis Radcliffe put the poison in the sandwiches? He knew he would be out to tea."
"That seems fairly plain sailing." "Yes," said Tuppen, "that's all right so far. Then we can put against that the fact that he was poisoned himself, so that seems to rule him out.
There is one person we mustn't forget, and that is Hannah." "Hannah? People do all sorts of queer things when they have religious mania."
"She is pretty far gone with it too," said Tommy. "You ought to drop a word to Dr. Burton about it. It must have come on very rapidly," said Toppin. "That is if we go by what Miss Logan said. I believe religious mania does," said Tommy. "I mean, you go on singing hymns in your bedroom with the door open for years, and then you go suddenly right over the line and become violent. There is certainly more evidence against Hannah than against anybody else," said Tuppen thoughtfully. "And yet I have an idea." She stopped. "Yes," said Tommy encouragingly. "It is not really an idea, I suppose. It is just a prejudice against someone?"
Tuppen nodded. Tommy, did you like Mary? Chilcot Tommy considered. Yes, I think I did. She struck me as extremely capable and businesslike, perhaps a shade too much so, but very reliable. You didn't think it was that she didn't seem more upset? Well, in a way, that is a point in her favor. I mean, if she had done anything, she would make a point of being upset, lay it on rather thick. I suppose so, said Tuppen. And anyway, there doesn't seem to be any motive in her case. One doesn't see what good this wholesale slaughter can do her. I suppose none of the servants are concerned? It doesn't seem likely. They seem a quiet, reliable lot. I wonder what Esther Quant, the parlor maid, was like. You mean that if she was young and good-looking? There was a chance that she was mixed up in it in some way. That is what I mean, Tant sighed. It is all very discouraging. Well, I suppose the police will get down to it all right, said Tommy. Probably. I should like it to be us. By the way, did you notice a lot of small red dots on Miss Logan's arm? I don't think I did. What about them? They looked as though they were made by a hypodermic syringe, said Tuppen. Probably Dr. Burton gave her a hypodermic injection of some kind. Oh, very likely. But he wouldn't give her about 40. The cocaine habit, suggested Tommy helpfully. I thought of that, said Tuppen, but her eyes were all right. You would see at once if it was cocaine or morphia. Besides, she doesn't look that sort of old lady, most respectable and God-fearing, agreed Tommy. It is all very difficult, said Tuppen. We have talked and talked, and we don't seem any nearer now than we were. Don't let's forget to call at the doctor's on our way home. The doctor's door was opened by a lanky boy of about 15. Mr. Blunt, he inquired. Yes, the doctor is out, but he left a note for you in case you should call. He handed them the note in question, and Tommy tore it open. Dear Mr. Blunt, there is reason to believe that the poison employed was ricin, a vegetable toxin of tremendous potency. Please keep this to yourself for the present, Tommy. Let the note drop, but picked it up quickly. Ricin, he murmured. Know anything about it, Tuppence? You used to be rather well up in these things. Ricin, said Tuppence thoughtfully. You get it out of castor oil, I believe. I never did take kindly to castor oil, said Tommy. I am more set against it than ever now. The oil's all right. You get ricin from the seeds of the castor oil plant. I believe I saw some castor oil plants in the garden this morning. Big things with glossy leaves. You mean that someone extracted the stuff on the premises? Could Hannah do such a thing? Tuppence shook her head. Doesn't seem likely. She wouldn't know enough. Suddenly Tommy gave an exclamation. That book. Have I got it in my pocket still? Yes. He took it out and turned over the leaves vehemently. I thought so. Here's the page it was open at this morning. Do you see, Tuppence? Ricin. Tuppence seized the book from him. Can you make head or tail of it? I can't. It's clear enough to me, said Tuppence. She walked along reading busily, with one hand on Tommy's arm to steer herself. Presently she shut the book with a bang. They were just approaching the house again. Tommy, will you leave this to me just for once? You see, I am the bull that has been more than 20 minutes in the arena. Tommy nodded. You shall be the captain of the ship, Tuppence, he said gravely. We've got to get to the bottom of this.
First of all, said Tuppence, as they entered the house, I must ask Miss Logan one more question.
She ran upstairs. Tommy followed her. She rapped sharply on the old lady's door and went in. Is that you, my dear? Said Miss Logan. You know you are much too young and pretty to be a detective. Have you found out anything? Yes, said Tuppence. Miss Logan looked at her questioningly.
I don't know about being pretty, went on Tuppence, but being young, I happened to work in a hospital during the war.
I know something about serum therapeutics.
I happen to know that when ricin is injected in small doses hypodermically, immunity is produced, and anti-ricin is formed. That fact paved the way for the foundation of serum therapeutics.
You knew that, Miss Logan.
You injected ricin for some time hypodermically into yourself. Then you let yourself be poisoned with the rest. You helped your father in his work, and you knew all about ricin and how to obtain it and extract it from the seeds.
You chose a day when Dennis Radcliffe was out for tea.
It wouldn't do for him to be poisoned at the same time.
He might die before Lois Hargreaves.
So long as she died first, he inherited her money, and at his death, it passes to you, his next of kin.
You remember you told us this morning that his father was your first cousin?
The old lady stared at Tuppence with baleful eyes. Suddenly, a wild figure burst in from the adjoining room.
It was Hannah.
In her hand, she held a lighted torch, which she waved frantically.
Truth has been spoken. That is the wicked one.
I saw her reading the book and smiling to herself, and I knew. I found the book and the page, but it said nothing to me. But the voice of the Lord spoke to me. She hated my mistress, her ladyship. She was always jealous and envious. She hated my own sweet Miss Lois. But the wicked shall perish. The fire of the Lord shall consume them. Waving her torch, she sprang forward to the bed. A cry arose from the old lady. Take her away. Take her away. It's true, but take her away. Tuppence flung herself upon Hannah, but the woman managed to set fire to the curtains of the bed before Tuppence could get the torch from her and stamp on it. Tommy, however, had rushed in from the landing outside. He tore down the bed hangings and managed to stifle the flames with a rug. Then he rushed to Tuppence's assistance, and between them, they subdued Hannah just as Dr. Burton came hurrying in. A very few words sufficed to put him abreast of the situation. He hurried to the bedside, lifted Miss Logan's hand, then uttered a sharp exclamation. The shock of fire has been too much for her, she's dead. Perhaps it is as well under the circumstances. He paused and then added, there was poison in the cocktail glass as well. It's the best thing that could have happened, said Tommy when they had relinquished Hannah to the doctor's care and were alone together. Tuppence, you were simply marvelous.
There wasn't much honor about it, said Tuppence.
It was too serious for play acting.
I still can't bear to think of that girl. I won't think of her.
But, as I said before, you were marvelous.
The honors are with you.
To use a familiar quotation, it is a great advantage to be intelligent and not to look it.
Tommy, said Tuppence, you're a beast. Agatha Christie, The Man in the Mist. Tommy was not pleased with life. Blunt's brilliant detectives had met with a reverse, distressing to their pride if not to their pockets.
Called in professionally to elucidate the mystery of a stolen pearl necklace at Adlington Hall, Adlington, Blunt's brilliant detectives had failed to make good. Whilst Tommy, hard on the track of a gambling countess, was tracking her in the disguise of a Roman Catholic priest. And Tuppence was getting off with a nephew of the house on the golf links. The local inspector of police had unemotionally arrested the second footman, who proved to be a thief well known at headquarters and who admitted his guilt without making any bones about it. Tommy and Tuppence, therefore, had withdrawn with what dignity they could muster and were, at the present moment, solacing themselves with cocktails at the Grand Adlington Hotel. Tommy still wore his clerical disguise. Hardly a Father Brown touch, that, he remarked gloomily.
And yet I've got just the right kind of umbrella. It wasn't a Father Brown problem, said Tuppence.
One needs a certain atmosphere from the start. One must be doing something quite ordinary, and then bizarre things begin to happen.
That's the idea. Unfortunately, said Tommy, we have to return to town. Perhaps something bizarre will happen on the way to the station. He raised the glass he was holding to his lips, but the liquid in it was suddenly spilled as a heavy hand smacked him on the shoulder, and a voice to match the hand boomed out words of greeting. Upon my soul, it is old Tommy and Mrs. Tommy too. Where did you blow in from? Haven't seen or heard anything of you for years. Why, it's Bulger, said Tommy, setting down what was left of the cocktail and turning to look at the intruder. A big, square-shouldered man of 30 years of age with a round, red, beaming face and dressed in golfing kit. Good old Bulger. But I say, old chap, said Bulger, whose real name, by the way, was Min Escort. I never knew you'd taken orders. Fancy you were blinking parson. Tuppence burst out laughing, and Tommy looked embarrassed. And then they suddenly became conscious of a fourth person, a tall, slender creature with very golden hair and very round blue eyes, almost impossibly beautiful, with an effect of really expensive ivory black topped by wonderful headdress and very large pearl earrings. She was smiling, and her smile said many things. It asserted, for instance, that she knew perfectly well that she herself was the thing best worth looking at, certainly in England and possibly in the whole world. She was not vain about it in any way, but she just knew with certainty and confidence that it was so. Both Tommy and Tuppence recognized her immediately. They had seen her 3 times in The Secret of the Heart and an equal number of times in that other great success, Pillars of Fire, and in innumerable other plays. There was perhaps no other actress in England who had so firm a hold on the British public as Miss Gilda Glenn. She was reported to be the most beautiful woman in England. It was also rumored that she was the stupidest. Old friends of mine, Miss Glenn, said Escort with a tinge of apology in his voice for having presumed even for a moment to forget such a radiant creature. Tommy and Mrs. Tommy, let me introduce you to Miss Gilda Glenn. The ring of pride in his voice was unmistakable. By merely being seen in his company, Miss Glenn had conferred great glory upon him. The actress was staring with frank interest at Tommy. Are you really a priest? She asked. A Roman Catholic priest, I mean, because I thought they didn't have wives. Escort went off in a boom of laughter again. That's good, he exploded. You sly dog, Tommy, glad he hasn't renounced you, Mrs. Tommy, with all the rest of the pomps and vanities. Gilda Glenn took not the faintest notice of him. She continued to stare at Tommy with puzzled eyes. Are you a priest? She demanded. Very few of us are what we seem to be, said Tommy gently. My profession is not unlike that of a priest. I don't give absolution, but I listen to confessions. Don't you listen to him, interrupted Escort. He's pulling your leg. If you're not a clergyman, I don't see why you're dressed up like one, she puzzled. That is unless.
not a criminal flying from justice," said Tommy.
"The other thing."
Oh, she frowned and looked at him with beautiful, bewildered eyes.
"I wonder if she'll ever get that," thought Tommy to himself. "Not unless I put it in words of one syllable for her."
"I should say aloud," he said.
"Know anything about the trains back to town, Bulger? We've got to be pushing for home. How far is it to the station?" 10 minutes walk, but no hurry. Next train up is the 6:35, and it's only about 20 to 6 now. You've just missed one. Which way is it to the station from here?"
"Sharp to the left when you turn out of the hotel."
"Then let me see, down Morgan's Avenue would be the best way, wouldn't it?" "Morgan's Avenue?"
Miss Glenn started violently and stared at him with startled eyes. "I know what you're thinking of," said Escort, laughing. "The Ghost." Morgan's Avenue is bounded by the cemetery on one side, and tradition has it that a policeman who met his death by violence gets up and walks on his old beat, up and down Morgan's Avenue.
A spook policeman. Can you beat it?
But lots of people swear to having seen him.
"A policeman," said Miss Glenn.
She shivered a little.
"But there aren't really any ghosts." "Are there?"
"I mean, there aren't such things." She got up, folding her wrap tighter around her. "Goodbye," she said vaguely. She had ignored Tuppen completely throughout, and now she did not even glance in her direction. But over her shoulder, she threw one puzzled, questioning glance at Tommy. Just as she got to the door, she encountered a tall man with gray hair and a puffy red face, who uttered an exclamation of surprise. His hand on her arm, he led her through the doorway, talking in an animated fashion. "Beautiful creature, isn't she?" said Escort.
"Brains of a rabbit.
Rumor has it that she's going to marry Lord Lenbury."
That was Lenbury in the doorway.
"He doesn't look a very nice sort of man to marry,"
remarked Tuppen.
Escort shrugged his shoulders. "A title has a kind of glamour still, I suppose," he said.
"And Lenbury is not an impoverished peer by any means. She'll be in clover."
"Nobody knows where she sprang from, pretty near the gutter, I dare say. There's something deuced mysterious about her being down here anyway. She's not staying at the hotel, and when I tried to find out where she was staying, she snubbed me. Snubbed me quite crudely, in the only way she knows."
"Blessed if I know what it's all about."
He glanced at his watch and uttered an exclamation.
"I must be off. Jolly glad to have seen you again.
We must have a bust in town together some night.
So long."
He hurried away, and as he did so, a page approached with a note on a salver.
The note was unaddressed.
"But it's for you, sir," he said to Tommy.
"From Miss Gilda Glenn." Tommy tore it open and read it with some curiosity.
Inside were a few lines written in a straggling, untidy hand.
"I'm not sure, but I think you might be able to help me, and you'll be going that way to the station. Could you be at the White House, Morgan's Avenue, at 10 minutes to 6? Yours sincerely, Gilda Glenn."
Tommy nodded to the page, who departed, and then handed the note to Tuppence.
"Extraordinary," said Tuppence. "Is it because she still thinks you're a priest?"
"No," said Tommy thoughtfully.
"I should say it's because she's at last taken in that I'm not one.
Hello, what's this?" This was a young man with flaming red hair, a pugnacious jaw, and appallingly shabby clothes. He had walked into the room and was now striding up and down, muttering to himself.
"Hell," said the red-haired man loudly and forcibly. "That's what I say. Hell." He dropped into a chair near the young couple and stared at them moodily. "Damn all women, that's what I say," said the young man, eyeing Tuppence ferociously. "Oh, all right, kick up a row if you like. Have me turned out of the hotel. It won't be for the first time. Why shouldn't we say what we think? Why should we go about bottling up our feelings and smirking and saying things exactly like everyone else? I don't feel pleasant and polite. I feel like getting hold of someone round the throat and gradually choking them to death." He paused. "Any particular person?" asked Tuppence. "Or just anybody?" "One particular person," said the young man grimly. "This is very interesting," said Tuppence. "Won't you tell us some more?" "My name's Riley," said the red-haired man, James Riley. "You may have heard of him. I wrote a little volume of pacifist poems. Good stuff, although I say so." "Pacifist poems," said Tuppence. "Yes, why not?" demanded Mr. Riley belligerently. "Oh, nothing," said Tuppence hastily. "I'm for peace all the time," said Mr. Riley fiercely. "To hell with war and women." "Women! Did you see that creature who was trailing around here just now? Gilda Glenn, she calls herself. Gilda Glenn. God, how I've worshipped that woman. And I'll tell you this, if she's got a heart at all, it's on my side. She cared once for me, and I could make her care again. And if she sells herself to that muck heap Lenberry, well, God help her. I'd as soon kill her with my own hands." And on this, suddenly he rose and rushed from the room. Tommy raised his eyebrows. "A somewhat excitable gentleman," he murmured. "Well, Tuppence, shall we start?" A fine mist was coming up as they emerged from the hotel into the cool outer air. Obeying their escort's directions, they turned sharp to the left, and in a few minutes, they came to a turning labeled Morgan's Avenue. The mist had increased. It was soft and white and hurried past them in little eddying drifts. To their left was the high wall of the cemetery, on their right, a row of small houses. Presently, these ceased, and a high hedge took their place. "Tommy," said Tuppence, "I'm beginning to feel jumpy." "The mist and the silence, as though we were miles from anywhere, one does feel like that," agreed Tommy. "All alone in the world." "It's the effect of the mist and not being able to see ahead of one," Tuppence nodded. "Just our footsteps echoing on the pavement. What's that? What's what? I thought I heard other footsteps behind us." "You'll be seeing the ghost in a minute if you work yourself up like this," said Tommy kindly. "Don't be so nervy. Are you afraid the spook policeman will lay his hand on your shoulder?" Tuppence emitted a shrill squeal. "Don't, Tommy, now you've put it into my head." She craned her head back over her shoulder, trying to peer into the white veil that was wrapped all around them. "There they are again," she whispered. "No, they're in front now." "Oh, Tommy, don't say you can't hear them. I do hear something, yes. It's footsteps behind us, somebody else walking this way to catch the train, I wonder." He stopped suddenly and stood still, and Tuppence gave a gasp, for the curtain of mist in front of them suddenly parted in the most artificial manner. And there, not 20 feet away, a gigantic policeman suddenly appeared as though materialized out of the fog. 1 minute he was not there. The next minute he was, so at least it seemed to the rather superheated imaginations of the two watchers. Then, as the mist rolled back still more, a little scene appeared as though set on a stage: the big blue policeman, a scarlet pillar box, and on the right of the road, the outlines of a White House. Red, white, and blue, said Tommy. It's damn pictorial.
Come on, Tuppence, there's nothing to be afraid of. For, as he had already seen, the policeman was a real policeman, and moreover, he was not nearly so gigantic as he had at first seemed, looming up out of the mist. But as they started forward, footsteps came from behind them. A man passed them, hurrying along. He turned in at the gate of the White House, ascended the steps, and beat a deafening tattoo upon the knocker. He was admitted just as they reached the spot where the policeman was standing, staring after him. "There's a gentleman seems to be in a hurry," commented the policeman. He spoke in a slow, reflective voice, as of one whose thoughts took some time to mature. "He's the sort of gentleman always would be in a hurry," remarked Tommy. The policeman's stare, slow and rather suspicious, came round to rest on his face. "Friend of yours?" he demanded, and there was distinct suspicion now in his voice. "No," said Tommy. "H.A.K., not a friend of mine, but I happen to know who he is." "Name of Riley." "Ah," said the policeman. "Well, I'd better be getting along. Can you tell me where the White House is?" asked Tommy. The constable jerked his head sideways. "This is it, Mrs. Honeycutt." He paused and added, evidently with the idea of giving them valuable information, "Nervous party, always suspecting a burglar is around, always asking me to have a look around the place." "Middle-aged women get like that." "Middle-aged, eh?" said Tommy. "Do you happen to know if there's a young lady staying there?" "A young lady?" said the policeman, ruminating. "A young lady, no, I can't say I know anything about that." "She might be staying here, Tommy," said Tuppence, "and anyway, she may be here yet."
"She could only have started just before we did."
"Ah," said the policeman suddenly. "Now that I call it to mind, a young lady did go in at this gate. I saw her as I was coming up the road about 3 or 4 minutes ago."
"It might be with furs on?" asked Tuppence eagerly.
"She had some kind of white rabbit round her throat," admitted the policeman.
Tuppence smiled.
The policeman went on in the direction from which they had just come, and they prepared to enter the gate of the White House. Suddenly, a faint muffled cry sounded from inside the house. And almost immediately afterwards, the front door opened and James Riley came rushing down the steps. His face was white and twisted, and his eyes glared in front of him unseeingly. He staggered like a drunken man. He passed Tommy and Tuppence as though he did not see them, muttering to himself with a kind of dreadful repetition, my God, oh my God." He clutched at the gatepost as though to steady himself, and then, as though animated by sudden panic, he raced off down the road as hard as he could go in the opposite direction.
Direction to that taken by the policeman. Tommy and Tuppence stared at each other in bewilderment.
"Well," said Tommy, "something's happened in that house to scare our friend Riley pretty badly." Tuppence drew her finger absently across the gatepost. "He must have put his hand on some wet red paint somewhere," she said idly.
Said Tommy. "I think we'd better go inside rather quickly. I don't understand this business."
In the doorway of the house, a white-capped maidservant was standing almost speechless with indignation.
"Did you ever see the likes of that now, father?" she burst out as Tommy ascended the steps.
"That fellow comes here, asks for the young lady, rushes upstairs without how or by your leave. She lets out a screech like a wildcat, and what wonder, poor pretty dear, and straightway he comes rushing down again with the white face on him like one who's seen a ghost."
What will be the meaning of it all?
Who are you talking with at the front door, Ellen? Demanded a sharp voice from the interior of the hall.
Here's Mrs., said Ellen somewhat unnecessarily.
She drew back, and Tommy found himself confronting a gray-haired, middle-aged woman with frosty blue eyes imperfectly concealed by pince-nez and a spare figure clad in black with bugle trimming. "Mrs. Honeycutt," said Tommy, "I came here to see Miss Glen." Mrs. Honeycutt gave him a sharp glance, then went on to Tuppence and took in every detail of her appearance.
"Oh, you did you?" she said. "Well, you'd better come inside." She led the way into the hall and along it into a room at the back of the house facing on the garden. It was a fair-sized room but looked smaller than it was owing to the large number of chairs and tables crowded into it. A big fire burned in the grate, and a chintz-covered sofa stood at one side of it. The wallpaper was a small gray stripe with a festoon of roses around the top. Quantities of engravings and oil paintings covered the walls.
It was a room almost impossible to associate with the expensive personality of Miss Gilda Glen.
"Sit down," said Mrs. Honeycutt.
"To begin with, excuse me if I say I don't hold with the Roman Catholic religion."
"Never did I think to see a Roman Catholic priest in my house."
"But if Gilda has gone over to the Scarlet Woman, it's only what's to be expected in a life like hers, and I dare say it might be worse."
"She mightn't have any religion at all."
"I should think more of Roman Catholics if their priests were married."
"I always speak my mind."
"And to think of those convents, quantities of beautiful young girls shut up there and no one knowing what becomes of them."
"Well, it won't bear thinking about." Mrs. Honeycutt came to a full stop and drew a deep breath.
Without entering upon a defense of the celibacy of the priesthood or the other controversial points touched upon, Tommy went straight to the point.
"I understand, Mrs. Honeycutt, that Miss Glen is in this house?"
"She is."
"Mind you, I don't approve."
"Marriage is marriage, and your husband's your husband.
As you make your bed, so you must lie on it."
"I don't quite understand," began Tommy, bewildered.
"I thought as much. That's the reason I brought you in here. You can go up to Gilda after I've spoken my mind."
"She came to me after all these years, think of it, and asked me to help her. Wanted me to see this man and persuade him to agree to a divorce. I told her straight out I'd have nothing whatever to do with it.
Divorce is sinful. But I couldn't refuse my own sister shelter in my house, could I now?"
"Your sister?" exclaimed Tommy.
"Yes, Gilda's my sister." "Didn't she tell you?" Tommy stared at her open-mouthed.
The thing seemed fantastically impossible. Then he remembered that the angelic beauty of Gilda Glen had been in evidence for many years. He had been taken to see her act as quite a small boy. Yes, it was possible after all, but what a piquant contrast. So it was from this lower middle-class respectability that Gilda Glen had sprung. How well she had guarded her secret. "I am not yet quite clear," he said.
"Your sister is married?"
"Ran away to be married as a girl of 17, said Miss Honeycutt succinctly. "Some common fellow far below her in station. And our father, a reverend, it was a disgrace. Then she left her husband and went on the stage, play acting."
"I've never been inside a theater in my life."
"I hold no truck with wickedness. Now, after all these years, she wants to divorce the man, means to marry some bigwig, I suppose. But her husband is standing firm, not to be bullied and not to be bribed."
"I admire him for it." "What is his name?" asked Tommy suddenly. That's an extraordinary thing now, but I can't remember. It's nearly 20 years ago, remember, since I heard it. My father forbade it to be mentioned, and I've refused to discuss the matter with Gilda. She knows what I think, and that's enough for her. It wasn't Riley, was it? Might have been. I really can't say. It's gone clean out of my head. The man, was here just now, that man. I thought he was an escaped lunatic. I'd been in the kitchen giving orders to Ellen. I just got back into this room and was wondering whether Gilda had come in yet. She has a latchkey when I heard her. She hesitated a minute or two in the hall and then went straight upstairs. About 3 minutes later, all this tremendous rat-tatting began. I went out into the hall and just saw a man rushing upstairs. Then there was a sort of cry upstairs, and presently down he came again and rushed out like a madman. Pretty goings-on, Tommy rose. Mrs. Honeycutt, let us go upstairs at once. I am afraid. What of? Afraid that you have no red wet paint in the house. Mrs. Honeycutt stared at him. Of course I haven't. That is what I feared, said Tommy gravely. Please let us go to your sister's room at once. Momentarily silenced, Mrs. Honeycutt led the way. They caught a glimpse of Ellen in the hall, backing hastily into one of the rooms. Mrs. Honeycutt opened the first door at the top of the stairs. Tommy and Tuppence entered close behind her. Suddenly, she gave a gasp and fell back. A motionless figure in black and ermine lay stretched on the sofa. The face was untouched, a beautiful, soulless face like a mature child asleep. The wound was on the side of the head. A heavy blow with some blunt instrument had crushed in the skull. Blood was dripping slowly onto the floor, but the wound itself had long since ceased to bleed. Tommy examined the prostrate figure. His face very white. So, he said at last, he didn't strangle her after all. What do you mean? Who? Cried Mrs. Honeycutt. Is she dead? Oh yes, Mrs. Honeycutt, she's dead, murdered. The question is by whom, not that it is much of a question. Funny, for all his ranting words, I didn't think the fellow had got it in him. He paused a minute, then turned to Tuppence with decision. Will you go out and get a policeman or ring up the police station from somewhere? Tuppence nodded. She too was very white. Tommy led Mrs. Honeycutt downstairs again. I don't want there to be any mistake about this, he said. Do you know exactly what time it was when your sister came in? Yes, I do, said Mrs. Honeycutt, because I was just setting the clock on 5 minutes, as I have to do every evening. It gains just 5 minutes a day. It was exactly 8 minutes past 6 by my watch, and that never loses or gains a second. Tommy nodded. That agreed perfectly with the policeman's story. He had seen the woman with the white furs go in at the gate. Probably 3 minutes had elapsed before he and Tuppence had reached the same spot. He had glanced at his own watch then and had noted that it was just 1 minute after the time of their appointment. There was just the faint chance that someone might have been waiting for Gilda Glenn in the room upstairs, but if so, he must still be hiding in the house. No one but James Riley had left it. He ran upstairs and made a quick but efficient search of the premises, but there was no one concealed anywhere. Then he spoke to Ellen. After breaking the news to her and waiting for her first lamentations and invocations to the saints to have exhausted themselves, he asked a few questions. Had anyone come to the house that afternoon asking for Miss Glenn? No one whatsoever. Had she herself been upstairs at all that evening?
Yes, she'd gone up at 6 o'clock as usual to draw the curtains, or it might have been a few minutes after 6. Anyway, it was just before that wild fellow came breaking the knocker down. She'd run downstairs to answer the door, and him, a black-hearted murderer. At the time, Tommy let it go at that, but he still felt a curious pity for Riley and an unwillingness to believe the worst of him. And yet, there was no one else who could have murdered Gilda Glenn. Mrs. Honeycutt and Ellen had been the only two people in the house. He heard voices in the hall and went out to find Tuppen and the policeman from the beat outside. The latter had produced a notebook and a rather blunt pencil, which he licked surreptitiously. He went upstairs and surveyed the victim stolidly, merely remarking that if he was to touch anything, the inspector would give him beans. He listened to all Mrs. Honeycutt's hysterical outbursts and confused explanations, and occasionally, he wrote something down.
His presence was calming and soothing.
Tommy finally got him alone for a minute or two on the steps outside as he departed to telephone headquarters. "Look here," said Tommy, "you saw the deceased turning in at the gate, you say?"
"Are you sure she was alone?"
"Oh, she was alone all right. Nobody with her."
"And between that time and when you met us, nobody came out of the gate?"
"Not a soul. You'd have seen them if they had."
"In course I should."
"Nobody came out till that wild chap did." The majesty of the law moved portentously down the steps and paused by the white gatepost which bore the imprint of a hand in red. "Kind of amateur he must have been," he said pityingly, "to leave a thing like that."
Then he swung out into the road. It was the day after the crime.
Tommy and Tuppence were still at the Grand Hotel, but Tommy had thought it prudent to discard his clerical disguise.
James Riley had been apprehended and was in custody.
His solicitor, Mr. Marple, had just finished a lengthy conversation with Tommy on the subject of the crime. "I never would have believed it of James Riley," he said simply. "He's always been a man of violent speech, but that's all."
Tommy nodded.
"If you disperse energy in speech, it doesn't leave you too much over for action."
"What I realize is that I shall be one of the principal witnesses against him."
"That conversation he had with me just before the crime was particularly damning. And in spite of everything, I like the man, and if there was anyone else to suspect, I should believe him to be innocent."
"What's his own story?"
The solicitor pursed up his lips. "He declares that he found her lying there dead. But that's impossible, of course. He's using the first lie that comes into his head because if he happened to be speaking the truth, it would mean that our good Mrs. Honeycutt committed the crime, and that is fantastic."
"Yes, he must have done it. The maid heard her cry out, remember?" "The maid." Tommy was silent a moment.
Then he said thoughtfully, "What credulous creatures we are, really. We believe evidence as though it were gospel truth."
"And what is it really?"
"Only the impressions conveyed to the mind by the senses."
"And suppose they're the wrong impressions?"
The lawyer shrugged his shoulders. "Oh, we all know that there are unreliable witnesses who remember more and more as time goes on, with no real intention to deceive. I don't mean only that.
I mean all of us. We say things that aren't really so and never know that we've done so.
For instance, both you and I, without doubt, have said some time or other, 'There's the post,' when what we really meant was that we'd heard a double knock and the rattle of the letterbox. 9 times out of 10, we'd be right, and it would be the post, but just possibly the 10th time, it might be only a little urchin playing a joke on us."
See what I mean?
Yes, said Mr. Marvel slowly, but I don't see what you're driving at.
Don't you?
I'm not sure that I do myself, but I'm beginning to see. It's like the stick tuppence, you remember one end of it pointed one way, but the other end always points the opposite way. It depends whether you get hold of it by the right end. Doors open, but they also shut. People go upstairs, but they also go downstairs. Boxes shut, but they also open.
What do you mean? Demanded Tuppence.
It's so ridiculously easy, really, said Tommy, and yet it's only just come to me.
How do you know when a person's come into the house?
You hear the door open and bang too, and if you're expecting anyone to come in, you will be quite sure it is them.
But it might just as easily be someone going out. But Miss Glenn didn't go out.
No, I know she didn't, but someone else did, the murderer.
But how did she get in then?
She came in whilst Mrs. Honeycutt was in the kitchen talking to Ellen.
They didn't hear her.
Mrs. Honeycutt went back to the drawing room, wondered if her sister had come in, and began to put the clock right. And then, as she thought, she heard her come in and go upstairs.
Well, what about?
That the footsteps going upstairs?
That was Ellen going up to draw the curtains, you remember.
Mrs. Honeycutt said her sister paused before going up. That pause was just the time needed for Ellen to come out from the kitchen into the hall. She just missed seeing the murderer. But Tommy, cried Tuppence, the cry she gave, that was James Riley, didn't you notice what a high-pitched voice he has?
In moments of great emotion, men often squeal just like a woman.
But the murderer, we'd have seen him.
We did see him, we even stood talking to him. Do you remember the sudden way that policeman appeared?
That was because he stepped out of the gate just after the mist cleared from the road.
It made us jump, don't you remember?
After all, though we never think of them as that, policemen are men just like any other men. They love, and they hate, they marry. I think Gilda Glenn met her husband suddenly just outside that gate and took him in with her to thrash the matter out. He hadn't Riley's relief of violent words, remember? He just saw red, and he had his truncheon handy.
Thank you very much for listening to this story.
Don't forget to subscribe to the Story Vault channel, and be sure to leave a comment.